All right. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Sue Gelsey here from JCC Association. On the line, we also have several of my colleagues from JCC Association, and we're climbing over 100 participants on this call. As always, we acknowledge the variety of things everyone is juggling, and we're appreciative of you finding the time to join us on these calls. The questions you pose and what you bring to it is just as important as the panelists themselves. A reminder that we're going to keep everyone muted during the call. If you have a question, please put it in the chat feature directed privately to JCC Association, and we'll gather those for the Q&A portion. To start, I'll state what I suspect is somewhat the obvious. We're all sitting here in amazement at the pace of change over the last day, 2 days, a week. And while we at JCC Association try to deliver experts and experience to you, we also recognize that the needs continue to evolve and at different paces at different centers and camps. So our call today is going to be focused on two aspects of financial planning, around employment issues and around security issues. But we also recognize that many of you are in parallel managing the current remote workforce that you've established and remote programming that you're standing up in real time, and also planning for the months ahead, the new normal, as we're now calling it. As you may have already seen, about 2 hours ago, Gabe shared an email announcing another call for tomorrow at 1 p.m. Please know all these calls are being recorded, so if you're unable to attend one, you could see the recording afterwards. But the call tomorrow, we're going to have 3 executives on a panel, really sharing their experience in the last few days on roadmaps for developing their near-term and their new normal. They'll speak about their current approaches to employment issues, facility, and seeking revenue sources. And they'll also reflect on their considerations, deliberations, and process for planning further out as we look to see the months ahead of us and what after these future months will hold. So that's tomorrow, but for today, we're going to focus on the current employment and budget management needs that we're all encountering in real time. We're really pleased to have with us Andy Eisenberg, who is a JCC Association board member and a partner at Castangi, Brooks, Smith, and Profetti. I hope I've said that right. A firm that is devoted to workplace law. And Michael Masters, National Director and Chief Executive Officer of Secure Community Network. And Mark Jardina, Assistant Deputy Director for Secure Community Network's Regional Security and Community Engagement Programs. So in advance, thank you to our guests, our experts. I'm going to start with Andy, and we're just going to have to make sure that we're unmuting him. Andy's going to offer us an overview about some of the workplace questions that have come to us from you, as well as ones that we've heard on previous calls. So let's just first confirm that we're able to hear Andy. If we could test that. Where are we? Okay, hold on. Whoever's managing it, it's the one that's called Sue Gelsey that's on a phone line without a video. Any luck on that? All right, let's try something else. Andy, I see you on the video. Are you able to unmute yourself on the video? Can you add your audio on your video? Because you're unmuted there. No, it's not working. Okay, But we're gonna pivot. I'm gonna start with Michael Masters and the SCN team, and Andy, we're gonna have someone work with you to make sure we get you up and running so that you're able to share with this group. Okay, so I will trust one of my colleagues will get with you on that. Michael, I know I saw you. Are you on?
I am. Can you hear me?
I can. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
So, relative to SCN, these questions came up. I think at our last call, you know, people are looking on a practical level, you know, what are their needs around security in now mostly uninhabited buildings and uninhabited campuses. And you know, what's realistic on a budgetary point of view, and what's practical for continuing services, and what can be discontinued. So if you can kind of give a high level overview on that, it would be really appreciated.
Sure. So first of all, Sue, thank you as always for the partnership. I'm joined by my colleague Mark Giardina. We're gonna go back and forth a little bit. I wanted to provide just a brief overview of what we've been working on the last couple of weeks to give everyone an idea, also just related to resources that we can share with all of you, related both to physical security as well as other considerations. I'll have Mark start with physical security, and I'll come back to cyber, particularly given the teleworking environment and off-campus situation that many of us, if not in already, foreseeably will be moving to. And I just want to say off the bat and reconfirm SCN's commitment as the official safety and security organization for the Jewish community, our partnership with JCCA and with all of you as individual JCCs. I think I've visited probably over 70 JCCs in the last 2 years since being in this job. I have 2 daughters, 12 and 5, that regularly visit a JCC in Chicago where we live, and I want to recognize the incredible work that all of you do to keep community alive and vibrant and moving forward. And our goal is really to support you in those efforts, even during this difficult time. I know it's a horrific decision to close a community center, given the value and role that you all play. So we're going to try and help as best we can. Since January, we as an organization have been really preparing for this as early as mid-February, and while the CDC still assessed the risk to the U.S. is quite low, we were releasing guidance related to staying informed, revisiting telework policies, business continuity practices, and developing a strong communication strategy. We can't stress that enough, and I just want to say as an overly broad comment, this situation is an incredible reminder of the need for ongoing safety and security planning for what we refer to as an all-hazards whole community approach. Whether we're facing pandemic today or blizzards in 6 months or hurricanes or tornadoes in certain climates, it stresses our need to really be trying to address these issues before we find ourselves in them. We're continuing to interface with our federal partners at the federal level, as well as local and state law enforcement. This is included not only putting out guidance, but working with and through our partners at the national level and with many of you on the line, as well as your colleagues in communities around the country at community centers, synagogue movements, camps, and other facilities, to ensure that we are able to operate effectively as a community, even in light of these changed circumstances. So that, you know, as we say, a facility may have to close, our community must always remain open in some form or function, and that's what we're committed to do. I'd also just point out, as we deal with this issue, and our core of our business every day is on safety and security, sadly, while so many of us are focused on COVID-19, we are seeing an incredible uptick in activity online related to anti-Semitic tropes, blame being placed on the Jewish community for the current situation, and actual activities and actions being advocated to be taken against the Jewish community. So even when we are making it through and out of this situation, we're going to have to come to the realization that as economic disruption continues and our economy and civil society is stopped or halted, we have a variety of other concerns that we're working to address with our federal and state and local government partners. What I'd like to do right now is turn it over to my colleague, Mark Giardina, who's presented at a number of JCCA forums and with many of you to talk about the physical closure issues for a few minutes, and then I'm going to come back to the cyber piece to deal with thinking about teleworking and maintaining community in this new dynamic. So, Mark, are you unmuted and able to be heard?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear. Go for it.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Sue, for allowing me the time to talk about some of these items. As a quick start, there's a lot of ground that we can cover as far as physical security, next steps, how to secure your facility when closing. I'm going to touch on some of the higher level items and some of the more common mistakes and pitfalls that I've seen, but we're going to be coming out with some guidance, some more detailed guidance in the very near future. So if you need anything a little bit more drilled down on or a little bit more detail on some of the items that we're talking about here, by all means, I think we're going to have a bit of a question and answer period. But more than that, there's going to be additional information. So one of the things to start is obviously considering your organizations as you close and close the doors. I've seen a few different examples of some creativity and a few different approaches to how those doors are being closed, whether it's a skeleton crew of staff or a duty officer. Something, or for that matter, armed or unarmed security that you already had that you're maintaining on site. One of the things to remember here as you continue on with that is a set of post orders for the security officers, or a set of guidance and information, communication matrix, response matrix for that duty officer who may be coming in and checking on the facility, what they're looking for, what they should be checking, whether it's windows, doors around the facility to check for different changes or suspicious activity, to include vehicles in the parking lot or a change in vehicles, keeping a log of this information, making sure that if that duty officer changes every single day, that you're able to collect that information and see how those things change. If there's all of a sudden broken glass underneath of a window, but the window's not broken, that could be a sign of somebody throwing something at the building or attempting to break in. So it's really important to collect this information, log it, and provide that guidance and information for who that duty officer may be, or that those unarmed or armed security that might be at your facility, and as well as your skeleton crew. In addition to that, some of the, and I'm going to, as I go through these, some of the items I'm going to be bringing up are just also some other creative approaches that I've seen that I've talked to some of you and some of your colleagues that they've done. One of the examples is I was speaking to a JCC the other day that they closed up shop, they closed the doors, they locked all the facility, but they gave the keys to local police. They informed local law enforcement that they would be closing the facility, but they gave the keys before they closed the doors. They went out and they purchased a bunch of coffee, some non-perishable foods, chips, things like that, stocked it inside, and told the police that if they needed to do paperwork or get some coffee, considering the long hours and extra hours they may be working, that they can then come inside and use that facility at all times. It's free security. You get a police officer parked out front, you get a police officer inside, that deterrent is automatically there. So being creative like that, thinking about how you can use your local resources, local law enforcement, what you can provide for them to be able to add that extra layer of security to your facility is absolutely invaluable. With that, if you can't go down that road, if you don't have those resources, if you don't have the resources for unarmed or armed security at your facility during those closure hours, something to think about here is also kind of showing signs of life at the facility. Leaving certain lights on, having your duty officer change those lights that are left on throughout the facility, making sure your external lights are very well lit, motion detector lights, that they're working, checking the maintenance on all of those things, dropping the shades, closing them at a 45-degree angle, mixing it up throughout the facility, which also shows signs of life, whether it means somebody's coming to and from the facility to check on things, or just that it is that deterrent. So if anyone is surveilling your facility or thinking about breaking in, whether it's financially motivated, opportunistic crime, or anti-Semitic, they will think twice, because everything has changed on a day-to-day basis, or potentially hour to hour, however you have somebody visiting the facility. A couple of other pitfalls that I want to gloss or that I want to touch on here is alarms and intrusion detection systems. A lot of your organizations, a lot of your facilities have these alarms, intrusion detection systems, things like that for if someone were to break in. But one of the more common pitfalls that I've seen is that third-party monitoring firm tends to have an old call list for who they're notifying. or maybe police are lower on the list, or the contact or higher on the list happens to be a facility manager that's no longer with the facility. Check those call lists for your third-party manager. Make sure they have accurate call lists on who they're calling, and they're calling people in the order in which you want them to call. In addition, make sure that anybody that's on that call list is very aware that they're on that call list, and they might be receiving a call, and they should know exactly what action to take if they do receive a call. Are they going to make sure police checks out the facility? Are they going to go check it out themselves to disarm the alarm? Any passwords that are involved, things like that, they need to make sure that they're fully informed. Excuse me. Contact your insurance carriers. This is another point that a lot of people are missing, and I know obviously you guys are probably talking to your insurance carriers, but consider contacting your insurance carriers, discussing any concerned issues for when you close your facility, any liability, any coverage, extra coverage you might need, and using it as an opportunity to walk through kind of your risk management portfolio to see if there are any other gaps in coverage. You know, a lot of areas where we have JCCs right now, you're closed, but there's natural disaster, obviously the pandemic, anything else that could happen. So just check over your coverage and make sure that you're comfortable with your current risk management portfolio. And then the final item, which I touched on earlier, final two items really, one of which I touched on earlier, is make sure you notify your local law enforcement to your closure. If you have a contact with your local PD, even if it's a local patrol office, your district commander, make that phone call, make sure that they're aware that you've closed your facility, how long it might be closed, request that they increase their patrols. You know, every single time we've talked to local police, local law enforcement, sheriff's office, and asked them to do so, they have done so with no problem. They understand the sensitivities around Jewish facilities and facilities that are closing, especially during a time where civil society is having some issues, the economy's you know, suffering. So, you know, and the social response to some of these to the current environment can obviously be, it can result in an increase of financially motivated and opportunistic crime. So they're very aware of that, and they like to know these things, what facilities are closed. So by all means, make those phone calls. And then finally, you know, one of the things that I want to stress a little bit about here is when you close your facilities and you've done all that you can possibly do and you've put all that you can in place, at that point in time, you've done what you can do. But I want you to start thinking about now is recovery. One of the things we talk about through and through is that if there were a bomb threat in the national capital region on Jewish facilities, obviously there would be a reaction where there would be increased security, increased police locking their doors. There would be that increased profile, that security profile. But when it comes time to then decrease that profile because the threat is quote unquote gone, we need to make sure that we know how to communicate with our constituents, with our congregants, with our members on how to reopen and recover. So start thinking about recovery now. We're going to be working on some guidance in the very near future to talk about that, a little bit about recovery, resiliency, and things like that. But I want you to start thinking about that now, because eventually when you reopen your doors, there's going to be the question, is coronavirus gone? What does that mean to us? What protocols have changed? So these are things to kind of start thinking about now and moving through that. And then having the ability to transmit messages to your staff, whether it's in an emergency or constant communication, making sure that you can keep everybody informed along the way of what's happening, how it's happening, and what next steps are. Now, I know I moved over a lot of that very, very quickly, and there's some additional guidance that we're going to put out. But if there are any questions specifically when we put that guidance out, by all means, you know, I believe all of you have emails to the duty desk, and while I don't want to overwhelm them, you know, you can all call Michael anytime you want, day or night. But you know, if you do have questions or need those guidance, we are here for you, and we will do everything we can to get you the information and guidance that you need.
So Mark, you'll just put Michael's cell phone number in the chat? Is that how
I'm going to have it actually scrolling the entire chat.
That works much better.
It works for everybody else. Why not? Another 110 friends won't hurt. So let me touch very briefly on cyber, and thank you, Mark. The guidance that he referenced, as well as some of the tips I'm discussing with you, are all going to be available in the next 24 hours. The cyber stuff we'll get to Sue immediately. And then the physical security guidance. One thing I want to mention, everything that Mark discussed was low cost or no cost. We are very cognizant of the financial implications of what is occurring across the community right now. We want to make this as simple and easy as possible and not overwhelming. So when we think about cyber, there's three main issues we're dealing with right now, and we've been in touch with our partners at DHS and the FBI. One, efforts to compromise systems to disrupt online operations or for criminal purposes, notably threat. As many of you saw just this past weekend, the Department of Health and Human Services at the federal level suffered a cyber attack itself. As of the current time, the best efforts of organizations are going to be to work to mitigate the potential impacts of an attempted or actual breach, particularly as you're working or moving to work online or in a telework environment. So as an organization, if you have not closed and you're still opening, please test your telework solutions. Secondly, for any platforms, applications, things that you're using, turn on two-factor authentication if it's available. Work with your IT department to ensure all your antivirus software or that which your team members are going to be using, their laptops or whatnot, is up to date. If you have an online donations platform, please contact them and see if there are any ways to enhance the safety and security of that platform. Make sure that you have all the tools that they have in their chest available to you with respect to cybersecurity. Refamiliarize employees on how to identify a phishing scam. We're going to release guidance. We'll give you guidance specifically on this. The number one way that bad actors get into organizations is through all of us. Clicking on links, clicking on Google Documents, PDFs. So it's important that we re-educate on that before we work to that telework environment. And encourage all team members to do the following. Make their passwords unique, long, and strong. If they have not changed them, now is a good time to change it and test it before they move to an off-site situation. Don't use open Wi-Fi networks when doing work-related business. And now that Starbucks is basically closing around the country, it's harder to do that anyway. Be cautious of what you share on social media. Cyber criminals often get personal information through online profiles that they then use to make a personal connection with someone. That's how they get into the network or the phishing scams. And I just want to stress there's some basic principles that we want to outline for organizations. They're not to cause anxiety. If you haven't done them, this is something we can think about moving on. Any organizations that is not working in the cloud, we encourage you to do so. And that cloud network, that cloud system should be strong and vetted. Consider backup strategies and plans. Do you have updated contact information for all of your team members? Just like Mark mentioned about the alarm company, for you yourself, do we have emails, personal and work, phone numbers, just so that we can be in touch, so that we can check in? Think about a redundant email system. SCN works through Microsoft, but we also have a redundant backup system, and I'll give you, even though this is being recorded, this is my off-the-record tip. Google, for instance, allows you to develop your own domain name and offers particular services for nonprofit organizations, just so you're thinking through those contingency plans. And develop a communication strategy in case you don't have communications. This is an opportunity to really be proactively thinking about things, particularly as we move to a time where we have, unfortunately, downtime. Know that we're here for you. We're going to get that guidance out. Our strength as a community, as a system, as a group of organizations lies often in our ability to come together during times of crisis or hardship. We can stand strong and make it through this, as we have done many times before in our history, and we will. We will do it more effectively and more efficiently by working together. We are here as your partners, and we look forward to serving in that role with all of you, as we have done and as we hope to continue to do.
Thank you very much, Michael and Mark. Great tips. And we will go to some questions after we go to the next section. And we'll also look forward to getting those documents and tips from you at the point that they are ready to be shared. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to give Andy a take two. And the focus here, Andy's focus will be, as I mentioned earlier, on a lot of the employment issues that we are encountering with a remote workforce. And as we begin to face the reality of furloughs and layoffs as a real possibility on many fronts. So Andy, why don't we start kind of on a general overview about, you know, what your recommendations are to folks relative to remote workforce versus, you know, coming to a building that, you know, is not functioning.
All right, can you all hear me? We've been
Yep.
having little technical problems, and I apologize if you hear the phone ringing in the background, but we have a skeleton staff, and so I'm getting calls, as we're sitting here. I'll just ignore it. I want to start by telling you what's kind of going on. You probably have a sense of this from watching the news, but it definitely impacts everything that companies are doing. First of all, the federal government's response up until today has been pretty scattered and not very strong. It looks from the news like the government is now beginning to take the lead. But up until now, we've really been relying upon state and local governments to enact laws like shelter in place. I know in Boston that for several days they have barred meetings and groups of more than 25 people, and that basically has shut down most of the businesses. It's not just Boston and Massachusetts. Other states are doing the same. San Francisco has a shelter in place. And so we've really been, had kind of a scattershot around the country. There is a law, a new federal law that was passed by the House last Friday, and it provides for expanded family and medical leave, federal family and medical leave, temporary paid sick leave, and a refundable tax credit for employers providing paid sick leave. Last I looked, it had not passed the Senate. I have been told today that the Senate is going to pass it without any changes, and it's going to go to the president, but right now that's in limbo. Most of our clients have, to the extent they can, been closing their workplaces and having employees who can work from home do so. There are companies that cannot do that, and they just close the workplaces. Some of them are paying their employees, some of them are not. It's really all over the place. What we have been advising clients that if they can have people work from home, they should do so and pay them. And to the extent they have employees who cannot work from home because there's nothing to do, either to try to reassign them to a task or to pay them as long as they can. Some companies have no revenue coming in, and they are telling employees to use whatever vacation time, paid sick leave they have, and then to apply for unemployment. So it's really all over the place. And depending upon what state you're in, the state or municipal government may have done something. There really isn't anything at the federal level right now that we can look to. One of the questions we've been getting is, should we allow employees to come to work at all? And, what are the risks if we do so? One of the concerns from a legal standpoint is that the Occupational Safety and Health Act, the federal law, has what's called a general duty clause, which basically says employers are supposed to provide a safe workplace. And although this isn't litigated very often, I mean, it's out there. And an employee who comes to work and gets sick potentially could bring a claim or a complaint to OSHA under that statute. One thing we've been telling employees is you should not, under any circumstances, compel an employee to come to work who is concerned about their health and safety, and you definitely shouldn't penalize them or retaliate in any way if they don't. There are provisions under a variety of federal laws, including the National Labor Relations Act, which applies to both union and non-union employers. And an employee who feels that there is a direct threat to their health and safety and refuses to come to work and is fired or otherwise penalized potentially has the right to file an unfair labor practice charge against an employer. So I think the bottom line is that to the extent employees can work remotely, they should do so, and you should pay them. To the extent they cannot work remotely, you should try to find something else for them to do. And if you simply can't find anything for them to do, figure out whether you need to lay them off or there's some way to pay them either with sick leave, extended leave, or whatever. As I said, a lot of companies, at least for the next 2 weeks to 30 days, are just paying their employees, and if they can afford to, and waiting to see what happens.
So Andy, Andy, I just want to jump in. Sorry, it's Sue. I want to come back to some of the references you made to laying people off and paying and so on, but I also want to go back to the congressional piece. So let's think positively for a second. If this does pass the Senate and if it does get signed, what does it allow for?
Well, and again, until we see the actual bill that gets passed and signed by the president, we're not certain. But there are three parts to it that I think are relevant to an employer. One is that there's a temporary amendment to the Federal Family and Medical Leave Act that allows employees basically to take FMLA leave for coronavirus-related reasons. It will apply to employers with fewer than 500 employees. The Secretary of Labor has the authority to exempt employers with fewer than 50 employees, but we don't know whether or not they will do that. There is a temporary paid leave requirement that applies to leave for coronavirus-related reasons. And it basically, let me just find, I'm looking at the language of the statute. So it provides for 80 hours of sick leave for full-time employees, and it would allow employees to use the paid leave, and I'll read to you, to self-isolate because of a diagnosis of coronavirus, to get a diagnosis or care because of symptoms of coronavirus, to comply with a recommendation or order by a public official or healthcare provider that the employee would jeopardize the health of others because of exposure to or symptoms of coronavirus, to care for or assist a family member who is self-isolating, and to care for a child if the child's school or child care facility is closed, or if the care provider is unavailable. And it also says that if the employer already provides paid leave, then the leave mandated by this statute would have to be provided in addition to the employer-provided leave. And then the third part that's really relevant to employers is that there will be tax credits available to employers who provide this paid sick leave. Now, obviously, where JCCs are tax exempt, I don't know how that will really help JCCs. But that's basically kind of the essence of this statute.
Thank you. So going back to your reference, I'm sure we'll have questions on that later, but going back to your references about staff. So I think a lot of the agencies are hoping to and planning to pay people. You referenced 2 weeks. We've heard that a lot. Let's play out this scenario. You know, there's no income coming in, and the ability to continue that varies, but certainly is not unlimited anywhere. So what's your recommendation at that point relative to furlough versus termination? And, and how do the unemployment benefits work? For most of these centers are self-insured in that way.
All right, so let's talk about, because everybody's talking about furloughs. I think from a legal standpoint, you know, there's really a question as to whether such a thing exists as a furlough. It usually refers to a situation where employees are working kind of reduced hours. We've had clients who have come to us and said, well, we're going to furlough people, and they're not going to work at all. And then, 2 weeks, a month from now, hopefully we'll bring them back. And again, this is going to be driven by state law, where you are located. But we've looked at this in a few states, and in most states, there's no such creature as a furlough. A person is either employed or they're terminated. They're laid off. So, if somebody is employed, first of all, you have to distinguish between employees who are exempt from overtime under the Fair Labor Standards Act or a non-exempt. So you need to remember that any employee who is exempt and works even an hour during the week needs to be paid their salary, or they're going to lose their exempt status. Non-exempt employees that are paid hourly, you can pay them for whatever time they work. But if somebody is basically not getting paid at all, and potentially not even covered by benefits, they probably are laid off and terminated, and they're going to be entitled, depending upon the state, to collect accrued vacation. Some states require an employer to pay out accrued sick time. I can tell you in Massachusetts, paid time off, PTO, is considered wages and is required to be paid when an employee is terminated. I think if somebody is working and maybe covered by benefits and so forth, so you can make an argument that they're still employed, you need to let them use whatever PTO they have and vacation time and so forth. And, we've had clients call and say, well, we can't afford to pay out PTO, so, if people are terminated, we have a problem. And we're worried about letting people use their PTO because we don't have the money to pay that out. My response has been, well, it's certainly a lot less expensive to let people use PTO day by day than to have to pay them out in a lump sum if they're terminated. I think the other thing you can do, again, depending upon the state law, is you could probably freeze the accrual of PTO going forward, but let people use whatever they have used accrued up till this point. It's an unclear situation. I mean, this issue of whether somebody is still employed when they have no hours and basically not doing work versus being terminated, I think is going to end up being litigated. The other issue I think that is a real serious issue is health insurance. And you can look at your group health plan, but many group health plans require a minimum number of hours being worked for somebody to be qualified or be eligible for coverage. And, we've had a lot of clients who have called and said, well, we're going to keep covering our people even though they're not working and we're not paying them anything. I've said, you better call your health insurer and see if if they'll honor that. The alternative is that you need to put people on COBRA, even for a month.
So Andy, actually, while you're on, sorry, can I jump in while you're on benefits for a moment?
Right.
A number of places are looking at the possibility of continuing benefits, even while, maybe perhaps as part of a severance, but an interest in wanting to continue benefits, even if they can't continue to pay them and employ them. Is that something that's possible? And if so, how would that be managed?
Well, you can say, look, we're not terminating you. And again, I apologize, but I think a lot of this is murky right now. You can say, we haven't terminated you, and you're covered by our benefits. You're eligible to use whatever benefits, but we're not going to pay you anything. I think that you may have employees who say, well, this is tantamount to being terminated, and I'm going to apply for unemployment, all right? And in some states, you can apply for unemployment and get unemployment even if you're not terminated, if you've had a reduction in hours. So again, this is going to vary state by state. But if you're in a state where an employee can't apply for unemployment unless they've been laid off. You may have employees who come to you and say, look, I want to be laid off. I want to apply for unemployment. And unemployment, let me just say, creates problems in many states. If you are a nonprofit and the state allows a nonprofit to elect to pay unemployment directly as opposed to having unemployment, paying into the state plan. So you may all of a sudden be faced with employees applying for unemployment and the state sending you a bill for the unemployment. So I think, there's no kind of one plan that's going to fit everybody. And it's going to depend upon what your state law is and what your resources are. And also how your employees react to what the plan is.
Right.
Does that respond to your question?
It does. I mean, I think your word murky is probably the most persistent piece of this, and I think it's complicated, of course. So I have some other questions, but I think it's going to be more important to get the questions from the field. Before I turn to Jennifer, Gabe, did you want to share something about a conversation you had this morning? Gabe? Or not now? All right, we'll come back to Gabe later. Jen, do you want to take over with, oh, sorry, Gabe, back to you.
Sorry about that, Sue. Just sort of a follow-on to Daron's note in yesterday evening's brief regarding our efforts on behalf of the whole movement in terms of lobbying and such. The update is just that in some of our meetings this morning with JFNA and their Washington Action Office, we understand that the third Corona bill on economic stimulus, which you may have heard about, is moving more quickly than at least that office thought it would. This is Mnuchin's $1 trillion bill, which in the press you've heard about in terms of putting cash in people's hands and also supporting the airlines and cruise industry, et cetera. JFNA is working on behalf of Jewish community nonprofits to actually get stimulus for nonprofits. We are included, of course, both as a voice there at the table with them and would benefit if the legislation ends up including that. So we're providing information to them, and I just wanted you to know that. We, of course, don't know what the legislation will look like exactly, but that's my update.
Thanks, Gabe. Jen, do you want to pick it up with some questions for either Andy or Michael or Mark?
Yes, so there are a lot of questions coming in. I just want to say we're going to be very mindful of the time. Things that we don't get to live, we will get answers from our experts and be sure to share that back out with the field. Andy, I'm going to start with you and I'm going to ask that we try to get through as many of these as we can. To your last point about unemployment, there's a few questions about that, but one of them is, Andy, can you advise for JCCs that are really struggling to manage cash flow right now, as you can imagine? That's quite an understatement. What is the time frame that Jays can anticipate from the time that somebody files a claim until a JCC might get a bill for that unemployment claim if they're self-insured?
I don't know. I think that it's going to vary state by state. I think some states it's a monthly bill, and some states it may be a quarterly bill. But I think it's going to vary by the state you're in. And some states, I don't think even allow, there may not be this election. So you really need to, if it were me, I would call your state unemployment division and ask those questions about if you've made that election, you're going to know it because you're getting the bill. If you haven't made that election, I think you need to call and ask whether what your status is. My perspective is that if you are paying unemployment insurance, you don't want to change that right now. You're better off if you haven't. What I don't know is whether an employer that hasn't been paying into the fund but has been self-insured can change that now. And that's something your state employment agency is going to have to answer for you.
And a question going back to the legislation, a question about if a JCC has more than 500 employees in a year, was that the definition of a large employer?
Well, that's the definition, as I understand it, of an employer. That's that particularly with the sick leave, that it only applies to employers with fewer than 50 employees.
Okay.
And, the problem is that with dealing with statutory language, who knows what kind of regulations the Department of Labor will issue on an emergency basis.
For sure.
But my understanding is it doesn't apply if you have more than 500 employees.
Okay. I'm going to flip to a question for Michael. I think you're the right one, or Mark certainly can take this. There was a question about the Homeland Security grant deadlines. For one of our J's, that deadline was April 8th. Do you have any information for J's that we're looking into that about whether or not there are going to be extensions to those deadlines?
So we have checked with FEMA as in collaboration with our colleagues at the JFNA Washington, D.C. office. Just so that you're aware, FEMA is at this point largely working remotely. The thousands of grants that FEMA will receive from state administrative agencies by April 30th are going to be reviewed remotely, which is something that in my understanding and having worked with FEMA for the better part of the last 15 years, they have never done. The date that you referred to, the April 8th date, is a state date. Those are the dates that it is intended to come into the state administrative authorities. So what we would encourage is organizations that are operating to contact their state administrative authorities so that they can then push whatever buttons you have at your disposal to encourage the state legislatures, the state administrative authorities, the governor's office, to push those deadlines back, but understand that the states themselves have to get all that material into FEMA by April 30th. At this point, we do not have an indication that FEMA will modify the current timeline or deadline for receiving those NSGP applications from the states, or for the states carrying out the competitive process. Part of that is because, as you can well imagine, that grant suite is tied together, and the funding that is going to be made available, the Urban Area Security Initiative funding, the State Homeland Security Grant funding, many of our partners in law enforcement, Homeland Security and emergency management agencies are looking at the clock as they have spent down their prior year funding and looking to next year's funding to help them address the COVID-19 issues and emergency management impacts of that, to include having funds available to restock PPE. So a pushback in any of the timelines is going to impact those grants to our first responders. So again, this can all change. It's a dynamic environment, but at this point, there's no indication that the FEMA deadline to receive the state grant, the state applications, of April 30th will change. But we would encourage you, work with your state administrative authorities to see if they can give you any wiggle room around those state deadlines, which we know are coming up in the next several weeks.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you. Andy, go ahead.
Yeah. I was just going to say, just to kind of summarize, I think if you're in a situation where you don't have the financial resources to have employees work from home and pay them, and you are not self-insured for unemployment, I would say the best thing to do would be to lay people off, put them on COBRA, and let them collect unemployment. I think the toughest situation is for those of you who don't have the financial resources to pay people working remotely, but are self-insured for unemployment. And then, I think that's a real challenge, and hopefully there will be some relief from the government in that situation.
Andy, a lot of the questions that are coming up have to do with terrible and difficult choices that are being made either on the employer or employee side. So I'm going to rattle off a couple of examples. I'm seeing questions about if an employee is collecting unemployment, can the JCC do anything to subsidize that in any way without jeopardizing that category that they're unemployed? Or if an employee voluntarily defers a portion of their salary, or if a JCC asks people to volunteer to do that, what is the implication of them potentially catching up at a later date? Candidly, I'm sure there's going to be cash issues with that, but.
Well, are we talking about employees who are actually doing work? Because I think that becomes problematical if people are actually doing work, to ask them to agree not to be paid. I think in many states, on state law, that would be a violation of the wage and hour laws. If people aren't working, they're not actually working, and the employer is just paying them to help them, then I think you have a lot more flexibility to reduce what you're paying them because you have no obligation to do that. All right, so theoretically you could defer it, you could reduce what you're paying. But I think if people are actually doing work for you, you're going to have a problem. In terms of paying people while they're collecting unemployment, again, you know, it's going to be state by state. But I would think that, and I think probably in Massachusetts, that if somebody is collecting unemployment, you might be able to pay people unless the state viewed that as some kind of severance pay. And in this state, for example, if you pay people, give people severance pay, and you don't get a release in exchange for it, then the state is going to delay paying them unemployment until that severance pay has run out. So, you know, again, it's going to depend how the state views it. If the state is inundated, is trying to pay people unemployment, it could be problematical. I think you need to call the unemployment agency in your state and say, this is what we want to do. Is that going to be okay? That's what I would do in any state where that came up.
By the way, that's a common answer that we're hearing both from you and from SCN, right? If people aren't sure, please make sure that you are reaching out to those local or state officials that can give us the right answers, because there is such variability. Andy, one more question here, though there's a lot. If there's a governmental requirement for paid leave, as you talked about earlier with the stuff that's at the House and going to the Senate, the question here is that going to be funded by the government, or are they mandating that staff be paid, and that's in this case, the JCCs or our camps that would have to pay for it? I think I know the answer, but.
Well, my understanding of the way it's written is that the employer has to pay it, and then the employer is going to get a tax credit from the government. And that's problematical for nonprofits, because if you're not paying taxes, you know, what you're really looking for is the government to send you a check to pay for it. And one of the problems here is I don't think they've thought it through. Now, maybe that's going to be addressed, and in one of these future bills that they're talking about, providing some relief. But that is my understanding right now, is that it's on the employer to pay the sick leave and then get effectively reimbursed from the government.
Thank you, Andy. Sue, I want to be mindful of the time. I'm going to look to you to guide me.
Yeah, we were just looking at that. So Andy had previously expressed that he had some flexibility. So I think we're going to stay on another 15 minutes till a quarter after the hour. For those people that can, Jen is going to keep going through some of these questions. It seems like many will be with Andy. And we'll continue to record it. So if you've got a conflict, you can catch the last 15 minutes of the recording. But Jen, before we continue on, I just want to, can I assume what the remainder of the questions are going to be around the employment pieces?
That's what I'm seeing mostly.
I want to thank our friends and partners and supporters at SCN, Michael Masters and Mark Giardina, for joining us today, and for their truly unlimited resource to us, our entire field on a regular basis. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
And we'll get their resources to you as soon as we have them. Jen, back to you.
Jen, let me say one of the things. You know, I understand the answers are frustrating, and this is the problem with not having a federal, response to this, is that, every state, it has different laws. And so there just are no answers that necessarily apply to everybody. One of the other things, if you're going to lay people off, is to be aware that there is something called the WARN Act, which is a federal law. And some states have state WARN Acts, And you know, to make it even more frustrating, they're all different. They all have different requirements. They apply to different size employers. The Federal Warrant Act you have to have 100 employees to lay off 100, excuse me, the employer has to have 100 employees and you have to lay off 50 employees. And the law, I don't want to simplify it, the law is complicated, but it's something that you should be aware of. There is at least an argument that this situation would come under an exception to the Federal Warrant Act, which would allow you to give whatever notice is practical. You're supposed to give 60 days notice. What we're advising clients to do is if you come under a state or the Federal Warrant Act, to give people as much notice as you can. So as soon as you've decided you're laying people off, let people know, and hope that if anybody challenges that will, the government will, or the courts will say that sufficed. But just be aware that's another glitch here in you know, things not going smoothly.
And I'll use your earlier word, murky. It's a murky glitch, to be sure, for my own understanding. Let me keep going with some questions here. Andy, what about the opportunity? This is a question that came, I'll read it directly. Can you just cut everyone's pay, say by 50%, as long as it's above minimum wage? If a JCC is going to do that, take just a straight across the board, is there anything legally, is there any concern or anything that an exec should be thinking about?
As long as you're staying above minimum wage and you're complying with wage and hour laws, I think you can cut people's pay by 50%.
Okay.
What you need to watch, it's not just minimum wage. For people who are exempt, that is, you don't have to pay them overtime, there's a minimum under the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act that you have to pay people. Or they're gonna lose their exempt status. Now that may be something that's just theoretical right now. If you have a whole group of people who are at home and not working, and therefore not gonna work overtime, it may well be that the approach is just cut people's pay by 50%. If exempt employees suddenly become non-exempt, they're not gonna be entitled to overtime anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And then when you reopen and go back to work and reinstate people to their full salaries, the exempt people will regain their exempt status. But, you know.
There was a question actually about exempt employees, and JCCs have this fine balance, as you know, between both exempt and non-exempt employees. For those that are exempt, there's a question about can exempt employees be laid off and then pay them hourly for specific work?
Yes. If somebody is laid off and then you decide to treat them as a non-exempt employee, you have to make sure you're paying them enough that they're making minimum wage, and you'll have to pay them, they will then be entitled to overtime. I mean, the whole point of making somebody exempt is that you won't have to pay them overtime as long as you meet the requirements for them to be exempt, like paying them a salary. You're not allowed to make certain deductions. They have to meet the duties test and so forth. But if you're going to make a decision that we're going to make all our people non-exempt and just pay them hourly, as long as you watch to make sure that people aren't working overtime, or if they do, you pay them overtime, I don't see any problem in doing that. And then you can, at a later time, reinstate your exempt employees back to their exempt status. Because if you reduce their salary below what the salary test requires, they're going to be treated as non-exempt by the state and federal government anyways.
Okay.
Is that clear? Is that too?
I think it was clear to me. Hopefully it was clear to the person who was directing the question.
I mean, the bottom line is that yes, you can convert all your employees exempt. Then you just need to make sure that you pay them when they're working, that you're paying them at least minimum wage, and you pay them overtime if they work overtime hours.
Andy, a follow-up to that is how in this environment where people are working remotely and from their homes, how does an employer track hours carefully enough to ensure that somebody is in fact working overtime?
That's a problem. I can tell you what we've done, because our offices are closed. We have a lot of people working remotely. Our non-exempt employees in normal times clock in electronically to a system, and we're requiring them to do the same. Theoretically, exempt employees are paid their salary, and a lot of employees don't track their hours. And I think in that situation, you know, the employers just, it's the honor system. Obviously, if you go and you convert all your employees to non-exempt status, you know, you should have all your employees clocking in and clocking out, so you can track how many hours they're working, and if they're working over 40, that you pay them overtime. I mean, we're in a crazy situation. It's a crisis, but the law disappeared. So,
Yeah.
we
Thank
need
you.
to abide.
Thank you. That's helpful. Going back to the issue of if a JCC is going to elect to do a percentage cut across the board, there was a question about whether or not that the cut has to be identical. And I guess if not, are there any discrimination issues that employers should be aware of in making that determination about who's getting what percentage, or what class of employees are getting what percentage versus another from a legal standpoint?
Well, you certainly want to make sure that you don't discriminate against any protected categories. You are going to have to worry about, a lot of states have these, you know, pay equity laws. And so you want to make sure that you're not, you know, two people, male and female, who are doing the same job. You want to make sure that you don't cut one versus the other in such a way that it violates the pay equity laws. I mean, I'm trying to simplify some very complex situations. And again, not to make life difficult, but lots of states have pay equity laws, and they're all different in terms of what the criteria are and so forth. So you need to look at that. And, you know, in terms of wage and hour laws, you know, you need to make sure that you don't cut somebody so low that they're below the minimum wage. But I think that you could certainly treat employees in the same job categories and doing the same kind of work similarly. I don't think that you have to cut, you know, do an across-the-board 50% cut. The beauty of doing the same percentage across the board is that you probably don't have to worry about what I just described. But if you're not going to do that, then you really have to do an analysis of whether you are discriminating against any groups or violating you know, pay equity statutes.
And Andy, as you were talking, somebody was just asking the question with regard to pay cuts like this, would this, from your perspective, imply that there's an assumption that we've already laid off non-exempt employees? Because you can't really do a salary cut to the hourly if it's going to bring them below minimum wage.
Well, I mean, it depends on what you're doing. We have a lot of clients that are kind of looking at what they have been paying their non-exempt employees for a 40-hour week and treating that as their salary, or looking at how many hours they've been working and have been paying them that. So I think with a non-exempt employee, you could cut their hourly rate and continue to pay them for, you know, even the hours that they would have worked or not. If you're going to pay people non-exempts for just the hours they're working, you need to make sure the hourly rate is at least the minimum wage. But I don't think there's an assumption that you don't have any hourly people working. If you have let all your hourly people go and you're not paying them anything, then yes, we're talking about how to deal with exempt employees.
Right. I'm going to shift slightly, Andy. There was one of our JCCs was suggesting that in his community, they're trying to set up an arrangement whereby employees who are laid off, that they can also receive supplemental payments from an emergency fund managed by their local community foundation and federation. And this exec is asking if there's any legal concerns with that. So it's, you know, if there's an emergency fund set up by the Jewish Federation Community Foundation locally or potentially another source, should JCCs be concerned about their laid off employees trying to access that from a legal standpoint?
I don't think there's any reason that employees can't access that other than whether that's going to impact their eligibility to collect unemployment benefits. And I can't tell you that. I mean, I'd have to speak to each state unemployment agency and say, look, this is what this employee is going to do. This is how much money they're going to get. Is that going to in any way disqualify them or delay them from collecting unemployment? But I don't think it should.
Related to that, this question just came in. It's really an interesting one. Are there any ramifications of setting up an internal fund where employees donate their PTO?
No, I think you can do that. Again, I think it's clearer doing that for people who are employed, who are still employed, and lots of companies do that. They have programs where you can donate sick time and you know, to employees who get sick and so forth. I don't think that is a problem. I will tell you, I'm not a tax lawyer, so I don't know how you handle that and when you have to go and report your income, or whether that has to be reported on the employee's W-2 as income and so forth. But it goes on all the time. Again, I think it's a different situation if you have an employee who has been laid off and is looking to collect unemployment. I'd want to go and get an answer whether that's going to impact their eligibility for unemployment.
Terrific. I think there's one more here. Maybe more, I'll keep scanning. Understanding that many of the J's are paying people for the next 2 weeks. Beyond that, if they do need to lay off, there's a question about sick leave. And specifically, can employees take sick leave if they aren't sick, especially in this climate?
It depends on, so some states have statutory paid sick leave, all right? A number of states, even some cities have it. In that case, the employee's right to use the sick leave is a matter of what the law says, what the statute says. And unless they want to change the law, and a state legislature could do that, in most states you have to either be sick yourself or you have to be caring for somebody who's sick. Lots of companies have their own sick leave policies where they're not required to provide that by law. And in those cases, if it's just a company sick leave policy, even a paid sick leave policy, the employer makes up the rules. And therefore, the employer can change the rules. So you could say to an employee, go ahead and access all your sick leave, whether you're sick or not. And that's, you know, the situation with PTO, paid time off, where a lot of employers don't even distinguish anymore between vacation time, holidays, sick leave, and so forth. They just say, you have, you know, 20 days, 25 days of paid time off. Use it for whatever you want. When it's gone, it's gone. And in those cases, employees can access that. But I think a JCC, that if we're talking about a JCC policy for paid sick time, I think the JCC can change the policy and say everybody can use their sick time. What a lot of employers are doing right now, where they can't afford to pay the employee their salary, is telling people to use whatever paid vacation, sick time, PTO they have, and the employer will pay for that, assuming the employer can afford it. Right. And then when that's used up, it's used up.
Andy, thank you.
You have to make sure it's not what's called earned sick time, which is statutory sick time. And there, you can't change the rules. The state has to change the rules.
Andy, thank you. I know that there's a little bit of wrap up that has to happen. I just want to personally thank you for the master class that we all just got. Needless to say, this is very complicated, and I know you're walking somewhat of a fine line because you're providing legal perspective here. I won't even say guidance or advice. So I just want to thank you. And Sue, I'm going to turn things back.
Thanks, Jen. So before we wrap it, I'm actually going to turn it over to Gabe, who has some information about small business loan activity that he's done some research on to share.
Thanks, Sue. I just posted in the everyone in the chat, and I'll do it in a brief coming up too. We were under the impression, as you might have been, that the SBA Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program wouldn't cover, for small businesses, wouldn't cover a nonprofit. In fact, it was revised to include them. So that is something that we were encouraged for you folks to look at. It's administered by the state, of course, like the employment law, it's administered by the state. So we encourage you to take a look. We don't know which states have already begun to open applications and such, but we encourage you to take a look at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Gabe. And we're going to continue to do what research we can and share that information relative to loans that are available, and also to keep you updated on the congressional pieces that Andy was referencing. But now that we got the primer from Andy, I think everyone can keep close tabs on that legislation over the next, hopefully, just couple of days. So I echo Jen's thanks to you, Andy. You've been a tremendous partner to our field in so many ways. This is such a complex piece. I think any one of our executives would have taken a full hour with you. So I know we just scratched the surface, and we're incredibly appreciative. The big takeaway I got from you, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, a lot of the answers are so vague because they depend on the state. My best advice is if you are looking for an answer, call your state Department of Labor or the unemployment agency, and they should be able to tell you what their policy is going to be in this circumstances, because they're probably making it up as well as they go along.
That's right. Everyone's in new territory here. So thank you, Andy. Thank you all. Our survivors of the entire, 73 minutes, if I've done the math right. But this will all be recorded, and Gabe will make it available through either a brief or some other mechanism once it's been completed. Thank you all. Have a great day. And again, look at the brief that you just received today about a call tomorrow about a little bit more kind of future planning for the new normal. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you all.